Picture a summer in the 1970s, kids racing barefoot down the street. Their laughter carrying into the evening air while sprinklers clicked in neighborhood yards. Parents didn't hover. They leaned on porches with iced tea in hand, trusting that kids would come home when the streetlights flickered on. Life felt looser then, freer in ways that are hard to imagine now. The world seemed smaller, safer, and simpler. A place where neighbors knew one another and rules lived more in memory than in paperwork. Trust wasn't just a word. It was a way of life. Kids roamed blocks on bikes without helmets, climbed trees higher than their parents would have allowed, and played ball in streets that cars casually shared. Nobody thought much about liability or lawsuits. Scraped knees, broken windows, and the occasional sprained ankle were part of growing up, not matters for a legal settlement. Parents didn't carry around a list of warnings. They carried an expectation that kids would learn, stumble, and grow from their own adventures. It was a time when neighborhoods felt like extended families. A parent down the street might scold you as firmly as your own mother, and no one would object. Trust stretched across lawns and sidewalks, unspoken but understood. Rules weren't written in contracts. They were lived in daily rhythms, in the trust that people had in one another. It was a kind of freedom that required community, not paperwork, to hold it together. That freedom, though, came with risks. The toys, the playgrounds, and even the family cars reflected a world with fewer safety rails. Trampolines stood in backyards without nets. Cars carried kids without seat belts, and fireworks lit up more than a few driveways. These weren't considered dangerous. They were just life. The culture valued independence over caution, adventure over restriction. What would raise alarms today barely raised an eyebrow back then. Looking back, it wasn't that people were reckless. It was that people trusted life to unfold without constant oversight. The thought of warning labels on everything from coffee cups to lawn darts would have seemed absurd. Parents and kids alike accepted that risk was a part of living, not something to be shielded from entirely. That acceptance created memories that still glow warm in the minds of those who lived through them. But memory can also be complicated. What felt free and simple was often the absence of protections we now take for granted. Childhood then was a balance of laughter and danger, where the lessons were sharp and sometimes painful, but the sense of belonging was real. It was America before fine print, before safety disclaimers stretched longer than the instructions themselves, and before fear of lawsuits reshaped the way families played, gathered, and lived. But those innocent freedoms also meant kids had toys and playgrounds that today would come with more lawyers than laughter. Metal slides gleamed in the summer sun, their surfaces so hot they could sear the back of your legs before you even made it halfway down. Seesaws creaked and groaned, one kid at each end daring the other to jump off and send them crashing to the ground. Jungle gyms towered 2 or 3 stories high, made of metal bars that baked in the heat and rattled under the weight of fearless children. In the 1970s, the playground wasn't a padded, safety-tested zone. It was an obstacle course of danger and delight, and every kid knew it. The ground beneath these structures wasn't rubber or soft foam. It was asphalt, gravel, or hard-packed dirt. If you fell, you felt it. Skin tore against the pavement, elbows bruised, and sometimes bones broke. Yet these accidents weren't treated as tragedies or causes for lawsuits. They were badges of honor. A scraped knee meant you had played hard. A cast on your arm meant you had a story to tell when you returned to school. The risk was part of the fun, and the fun was unforgettable. Parents were usually there, sitting on benches or standing nearby. But they didn't hover or rush in at the first sign of trouble. A tumble off the monkey bars might get a quick check for blood, maybe a shake it off, and then it was back to climbing. Independence was the rule of childhood then, and the playground was where it was tested. Kids learned to balance, to take turns, and to push their own limits, not because the equipment was designed for safety, but because it wasn't. The merry-go-round was perhaps the most infamous of all. A circle of metal with bars to grip, it spun faster with every push. Older kids would run alongside, building speed until the riders inside were holding on for dear life. One wrong move, and you were flung across the park, breathless and laughing, or, if unlucky, limping home. It was chaotic, thrilling, and just dangerous enough to feel like a rite of passage. Looking back, it's easy to see how risky these playgrounds were. Today, cities and schools face strict regulations, liability fears, and safety codes that dictate every swing and slide. Rubber mats cushion falls, equipment is made from softer materials, and heights are kept modest to prevent serious injury. Parents expect this protection now, and lawsuits wait in the wings for anything less. Childhood play has been redesigned around caution, and in many ways, it's safer but perhaps less adventurous. For those who grew up in the 1970s, though, those metal slides and towering jungle gyms are remembered with a mix of fondness and disbelief. They were dangerous, yes, but they were also thrilling, shaping kids into risk-takers, storytellers, and survivors of the asphalt battlefield. But the danger didn't stop at the playground. It was wrapped up in the very toys kids begged for at Christmas. Lawn darts sat at the top of many wish lists, and parents didn't think twice about buying them. Known as jarts, these were essentially heavy darts with long, sharp metal tips, meant to be tossed high into the air and aimed toward plastic rings on the grass. The problem, of course, was obvious. What went up didn't always land where it was supposed to. More than a few backyard games ended with frantic trips to the doctor, but at the time, it was brushed off as just part of the fun. Chemistry sets were another favorite, and they weren't filled with harmless powders or color-changing liquids like the ones sold today. They came stocked with actual acids, flammable materials, and glass tubes that could shatter if you handled them carelessly. Kids would mix, stir, and sometimes light things on fire in the name of science. While parents proudly saw it as educational, it was hands-on learning with no disclaimers, no warning labels, and no thought of lawsuits. Even something as innocent-sounding as the Easy Bake Oven wasn't without danger. Using a real heating element or, in earlier versions, a powerful light bulb, these little ovens could and did cause burns to tiny fingers eager to pull out cakes before they were ready. Yet the toy remained wildly popular because nothing compared to the thrill of making your own dessert, even if you came away with a blister or two. BB guns, too, were practically a rite of passage. They were given as birthday gifts or Christmas presents, often to kids barely old enough to ride a bike without training wheels. The safety advice was minimal, usually something along the lines of, "Don't shoot your eye out," and then it was off to the backyard or the woods for hours of unsupervised target practice. For many, it was their first taste of responsibility or recklessness, depending on how you look at it. Advertising in the 1970s only added fuel to the fire. Commercials and magazine ads showed smiling kids launching darts, mixing chemicals, or wielding toy guns with no hint of caution. Safety warnings were minimal, and the focus was always on fun, freedom, and excitement. Parents were encouraged to give their children these toys, and kids were convinced they needed them. The risks were either ignored or downplayed, and the idea of lawsuits barely crossed anyone's mind. Today, most of these toys would be unimaginable on store shelves. Lawn darts were banned outright after too many injuries. Chemistry sets were redesigned with harmless substitutes. Easy Bake Ovens were recalled and re-engineered multiple times to prevent burns. BB guns are still around, but heavily regulated and sold with detailed safety guidelines. What once felt like a normal part of growing up is now seen through the lens of liability, lawsuits, and safety-first culture. Yet for those who grew up in the 70s, these dangerous toys remain symbols of a childhood filled with freedom, laughter, and a little bit of danger. They taught lessons sometimes the hard way that no instruction manual could capture. And it wasn't just kids' toys. Everyday family cars of the 70s would be unthinkable today. The cars of the 1970s were as much about style and power as they were about getting from place to place. Shiny chrome bumpers, long hoods, and engines that roared louder than the radio gave them character. But safety was often an afterthought. Airbags were virtually non-existent, and the seatbelts that were installed were rarely used. Many drivers simply tucked the belt behind the seats so it wouldn't get in the way, and few thought twice about the risk. Accidents were seen as part of driving, not something preventable with design and regulation. Children were even more vulnerable. Until the late 70s, car seats weren't designed for safety. They were designed to keep kids from moving around too much in the back seat. Infants often rode in flimsy carriers, or, just as often, on a parent's lap. Older kids slid across vinyl seats or stood up to lean between the front seats while their parents drove down the highway. In pickup trucks, riding in the open bed wasn't unusual. It was almost a rite of passage. Families piled in for trips to the lake or the drive-in theater, wind whipping through their hair, without a single thought of how dangerous it really was. Smoking was another normal part of life on the road. Parents lit up cigarettes with children sitting just a few feet away, the car filled with secondhand smoke. Ashtrays were built into the doors, and lighters came standard. The idea that this could be harmful or that someone might sue over it was far from mainstream thinking at the time. It was just the way things were. The cars themselves were built like tanks, heavy, solid, and seemingly indestructible, but beneath that steel frame, there was little in the way of safety engineering. Crash testing was minimal compared to today's standards, and design choices often prioritized looks or horsepower over protection. Sharp dashboards, rigid steering columns, and glass that shattered dangerously in collisions were all part of the package. Looking back, it's almost shocking how casually people accepted the risks. Today, not buckling a child into a proper safety seat would mean fines, lawsuits, or worse. Automakers face recalls and lawsuits for even the smallest safety oversight, while backup cameras, airbags, and crumple zones are expected features. In the 70s, the responsibility for safety fell almost entirely on the driver, and most people didn't give it much thought. Still, for many, those cars symbolize a freedom that feels rare today. Families took long road trips without worrying about regulations. Teenagers cruised Main Street with the windows down, and everyone seemed to feel a little more invincible behind the wheel. It was a different time, one where risk was taken for granted, and the ride itself mattered more than the rules. But danger wasn't only on the road, it was in the classroom too. School in the 1970s carried an energy that was both carefree and risky, a mix of innocence and danger that today would raise countless red flags. Discipline was swift and often physical. In many districts, corporal punishment was not just allowed but expected. A wooden paddle might hang in the principal's office, and students knew it wasn't just for show. Parents rarely questioned it, seeing it as part of keeping order. What would now result in lawsuits and news headlines was then considered a normal part of schooling. The buildings themselves were far from safe by modern standards. Asbestos lined the ceilings and walls of countless classrooms, installed for insulation and fire resistance, with little awareness of the long-term health dangers. Lead paint wasn't uncommon, and playgrounds built beside the schools mirrored the risks of the community park's metal swings and high jungle gyms standing over asphalt. Inside the classroom, health concerns that dominate schools today were barely acknowledged. Peanut butter sandwiches were a staple in lunchboxes, and allergies, if they were noticed at all, didn't reshape policies or menus. Parents didn't send detailed dietary instructions, and schools weren't expected to accommodate every individual need. Students shared food without hesitation, and no one thought twice about it. Recess and gym brought their own set of hazards. Dodgeball was played with hard rubber balls that stung when they hit, and the roughest kids often threw the hardest. Playground games leaned toward the physical tackle football, king of the hill, and endless climbing contests on equipment that had no safety padding below. Supervision was minimal, with teachers watching from a distance, assuming kids would sort out their disputes and pick themselves up from the scrapes. By high school, freedoms expanded in ways that would shock parents today. Smoking areas were often set aside for students, sometimes on school grounds, sometimes just beyond. Teenagers gathered there during breaks, lighting up openly, while teachers and staff often turned a blind eye or even joined them. The idea of wellness campaigns, anti-vaping lectures, or lawsuits over secondhand smoke was decades away. And yet, for all the risks, many students remember their school years with a fondness that comes from the very lack of oversight. There was room to test limits, to stumble, and to learn resilience. The sense of toughness and independence that came from surviving those years is still a point of nostalgia for many who grew up then. Today's schools operate with a level of caution unthinkable in the 1970s. Rules, liability concerns, and lawsuits have reshaped everything from playground design to classroom discipline. While children are safer, the trade-off has been a more controlled environment where freedom and risk are carefully managed away. And when the bell rang, kids went home to neighborhoods filled with freedoms that now sound reckless. Neighborhoods in the 1970s were their own kind of playground, wide open and unmonitored, buzzing with the sound of kids' laughter and bike chains clicking against the summer air. There were no cell phones tracking every movement, no GPS alerts pinging worried parents. The only rule that mattered was simple: be home by dark. Until the streetlights flickered on, the world outside was a boundless stage for adventure. Bikes were the prized possession of nearly every kid, and helmets were practically unheard of. Children rode down steep hills, doubled up on handlebars, or formed weaving lines of 10, racing each other without a thought for what might happen if they crashed. Scraped knees and bent wheels were the price of freedom, not a cause for panic. For many, that bike was a first taste of independence, the ability to leave the block, explore a friend's neighborhood, or simply disappear for hours. Tree houses and forts sprang up wherever kids could find leftover wood and nails, usually without an adult's guidance or approval. Hammers and saws were borrowed from garages, and construction sites became unofficial playgrounds. Half-built houses, dirt piles, and exposed nails weren't dangers so much as opportunities. Kids leapt off foundations, tunneled through half-dug basements, and turned those risky spaces into kingdoms of imagination. Even thirst carried a certain rough and ready flavor. No one carried bottled water. Kids bent down at garden hoses, passing them around to friends without a second thought. If the water was warm at first, they let it run until it cooled, savoring the metallic taste as just part of summer. The idea of sanitized, labeled plastic bottles would have seemed unnecessary, even absurd. Some adventures stretched further than the neighborhood. Hitchhiking, while risky, was surprisingly common. Teens especially relied on it when cars weren't available, standing by the roadside with a thumb pointed skyward, trusting that a neighbor, a friend's parent, or even a stranger would give them a lift. It was seen less as reckless and more as a resourceful way of getting from one part of town to another without much thought of danger. Parents trusted the community to keep an eye out. Neighbors knew each other's children, and there was an unspoken agreement that if trouble came, someone would step in. Mothers leaned out of doorways to call kids in for dinner. Fathers waved from porches, and a watchful presence lingered, even if it wasn't as visible as today's hovering supervision. It was a balance between freedom and trust that allowed kids to grow in confidence, toughness, and independence. Looking back, the risks were real, but so were the lessons. Every tumble off a bike, every splinter from a treehouse, every scraped elbow was part of learning how to navigate the world without constant protection. It was a kind of freedom that today feels both reckless and magical. Oh, but freedom wasn't just for kids. Adults had their own habits that today would spark lawsuits overnight. In the 1970s, smoke wasn't just a habit, it was the backdrop of daily life. Step onto an airplane, and before the seatbelt light even went off, passengers were already lining up. The cabin filled with a gray haze, and no one thought twice about it. Restaurants offered smoking and non-smoking sections, though the thin line of division made little difference. Offices, grocery stores, bowling alleys, everywhere you turned, cigarettes were part of the air. If you didn't smoke, you still inhaled it daily. Advertising didn't just normalize the habit, it celebrated it. Cigarette brands enlisted athletes, movie stars, and even doctors to promote their products. A calm-voiced actor in a white coat might assure you that one brand was less irritating to the throat, while rugged cowboys and glamorous women made smoking look like the key to confidence and freedom. The message was everywhere, splashed across billboards, television, and magazines. Lighting up wasn't just a choice, it was a cultural shorthand for fitting in. The reach of smoking stretched into homes as well. Ashtrays weren't an accessory, they were part of the furniture. Built into cars, coffee tables, and even airplane armrests, they were a permanent fixture. Guests arriving at a friend's house could expect to find a lighter and a pack on the kitchen counter, and children grew up watching parents and relatives casually puff away during dinner or while watching TV. The blue-gray haze was as much a part of childhood as the jingles on Saturday morning cartoons. The effects, of course, were invisible at the time. Secondhand smoke wasn't a public concern, and health risks were downplayed. Kids sat in the backseat of cars with windows rolled up, enveloped in clouds of cigarette smoke while parents tapped ashes into the built-in trays. No one questioned the exposure, and no lawsuits loomed on the horizon. Looking back now, it's hard to imagine a world where smoking was so casual, so unquestioned, and so ingrained into daily life. Today, lawsuits would be endless. Restaurants would be fined, airlines would face public outrage, and companies would be sued for negligence. The cultural shift has been dramatic. What was once a sign of sophistication is now wrapped in bold health warnings and strict bans. And yet, part of the surprise lies in how recent it all was. For many, memories of smoky bowling alleys or long flights filled with ash still feel vivid, a reminder of how quickly society can change its mind about what is acceptable. The contrast with today's clean air rules underscores just how unregulated the 70s really were. And right alongside cigarettes came another kind of indulgence, the freedom to eat and drink without a single warning label. The 1970s were a decade when indulgence was practically a way of life. Breakfast could easily start with a bowl of neon-colored cereal, coated in sugar and marketed with a cartoon mascot that every kid adored. Parents didn't scan nutrition labels. There weren't any detailed ones to read. Instead, the boxes promised fun, games, and maybe a free toy inside. The idea of worrying about grams of sugar or additives simply didn't cross most people's minds. Soda flowed just as freely. Cans of cola or root beer weren't reserved for special occasions. They were lunchtime staples. Vending machines lined school hallways, gas stations and workplaces offering sugary pick-me-ups at every turn. Candy, too, was an everyday companion. Kids bought it with spare change at corner stores, munching on chocolate bars or chewing bright sticks of bubblegum without a hint of guilt. It wasn't about health, it was about joy. Dinner didn't escape the trend. TV trays were pulled out, frozen meals popped into ovens, and families sat in front of the television with a plate of Salisbury steak or fried chicken that came straight from a box. Drive-through culture was booming too. Burgers, fries, and milkshakes were cheap, fast, and satisfying, and the golden arches rising on highway exits became as familiar a landmark as the local water tower. No one asked how many calories were in the combo meal. They simply enjoyed it. Advertising reflected this carefree attitude. Commercials made soda look glamorous, candy irresistible, and fast food a treat worth craving. Alcohol, too, was marketed in ways that today would spark outrage. Beer ads often carried a youthful, playful tone, and liquor commercials leaned on themes of sophistication that blurred the lines for younger audiences watching. Regulation was minimal, and the focus was on fun, not consequences. Health consciousness was only beginning to emerge. A handful of voices warned of processed foods and rising obesity, but they were drowned out by the cultural embrace of convenience and flavor. Exercise wasn't yet paired with diet culture, and gyms weren't the everyday destinations they would later become. Life was about living, not counting. Looking back now, it's astonishing how unregulated it all was. Today, lawsuits would pile up against companies marketing sugary cereals directly to children, or alcohol brands hinting at youthful fun. Calorie counts, warning labels, and marketing restrictions have reshaped the landscape. Fast food chains now post nutrition facts, soda sizes are debated in courtrooms, and even candy packaging comes with legal fine print. Yet for those who grew up in the 70s, the memory of that indulgence is sweet literally. It was a time when food was about taste, not numbers, and a culture of carefree consumption left behind stories as sticky and colorful as the candy wrappers stuffed in kids' pockets. But indulgence wasn't the only freedom. The very laws of safety and liability were looser across the board. The 1970s gave America freedoms that today feel almost impossible to imagine. Kids hurled lawn darts across the yard. Families rode in cars without seatbelts, and smoke curled through restaurants, airplanes, and living rooms without a second thought. Playgrounds were built like obstacle courses. Food was served without labels, and neighborhoods pulsed with the laughter of children roaming far from home. Each of these memories carries a mix of danger and delight, a reminder that growing up then meant learning resilience the hard way. It was a time defined less by caution and more by trust. Parents trusted their kids to return home by dark. Schools trusted students to take responsibility, even if it meant scraped knees or the sting of a dodgeball. Communities trusted one another to keep watch, to lend a hand, to step in if something went wrong. That trust created a sense of belonging, a feeling that childhood was not just protected, but lived in full. The risks were real, but so were the rewards: independence, courage, and a kind of freedom that no legal waiver could provide. The contrast with today couldn't be sharper. Now, every product comes with a warning label, every playground is padded, and every public space is carefully regulated. We live in a time where safety is written into law, and liability lurks in the fine print. Parents hover, schools prepare for lawsuits, and children grow up in worlds shaped by risk assessments. Many would argue that we are safer now, and we are. Fewer broken bones, fewer burns, fewer dangers brushed aside. But what we've gained in protection, we may have lost in spirit. Because what lingers from the 70s isn't the danger, it's the memories. The sting of hot metal slides, the sweet burn of soda gulped too fast, the rush of riding in the back of a pickup truck under a summer sky. These are the moments that stitched together a generation. They taught problem-solving, toughness, and the joy of unstructured play. They made childhood not just a stage of life, but a story worth telling. And maybe that's the lesson the 1970s still carry for us today. We don't need to bring back asbestos classrooms or cigarette smoke in airplanes. But we can remember what it felt like to live a little looser, to breathe without fear of every small risk, to trust ourselves and each other more than the rules on a page. The best of that past isn't gone. It waits for us in how we choose to raise our kids, build our communities, and live our own lives. So let the warnings stand where they should. But don't forget the laughter that once filled America's backyards and streets. The America we left behind still lives on in memory, in spirit, and in the stories we share. If you grew up in the 70s or heard the tales passed down, share them. Keep them alive. Because in remembering, we carry forward the freedom, the resilience, and the joy of a time when life felt just a little wilder and a little more free.